She stepped from the stagecoach into noon heat, carrying nothing but a worn canvas bag and a single folded letter, and the dust of the road tried to swallow both. She asked the driver for the next connection west. He shrugged. Rains had washed the timber bridge. No coach till week's end. The depot agent pointed to the only roof on the horizon, a cattle ranch 4 hard miles south where travelers could barter hay for shelter. She set out on foot, boots scuffing alkali, letter beating her ribs like a nervous heart. He saw her first as a shimmer above the fence line, another mirage over dun grass, until the mirage pushed open his gate and asked for a cup of water. Clay Harper had spoken little since drought took his herd and fever took the rest. But he nodded, filled a dipper, watched her drink with the careful caution of someone counting blessings down to drops. She said her name was Nora Reed and that she was just passing through. He didn't correct the lie. Passing souls rarely carried eyes that bold or weariness that deep. Midday stretched quiet. She offered coin for a night in the hayloft. He waved it off, pointed to the bunkhouse unused since the last drifters moved on. She followed, noting fences mended by one pair of hands, noting silence thick as wool around every nail. In the bunkhouse mirror, she saw road dust on cheekbones, streaks of sweat carving small rivers toward her collar. She washed with rain barrel water, opened the letter, read the single line again. Find him. Tell him I forgive. The ink had blurred where tears once fell. Hers or the sender's she could no longer tell. She folded it back, tucked it under her pillow, and stepped outside where the ranch slept under a sky too wide for sorrow. She found Clay in the barn dressing a split hoof. He worked with a focus that shut out everything not breathing under his hands. She coiled a rope, fetched liniment without being asked. When horse and rancher quieted, he looked at her with a question he didn't voice. She answered with a small shrug. Helping was lighter than standing still. Dusk bled over the paddock. He pointed to the porch, produced 2 tin plates, half a loaf, beans salted heavy. They ate in hush broken only by cicadas tuning the night. Wind carried the smell of distant rain. She closed her eyes, felt something in her chest unclench at the sound of nothing demanded. At Lantern's dim edge, she asked for ink and paper. He brought a stump of pencil and a scrap torn from ledger margins. She wrote 3 words, folded them, set them beside his coffee. Thank you, stranger. He read the note, pocketed it, whispered nothing, but his shoulders eased as if the words had weight he'd been aching to hold. Midnight thunder rolled low. She woke to roof creaks, to memories of stations where strangers spoke too sweet and hands reached too fast. Here only rain tapped shingles like gentle knuckles. She listened to its rhythm until sleep found her again. Dawn fogged the corral's pail. She brewed chicory in the bunkhouse pot, carried a cup to the porch where he already sat bootlacing. Coyotes had shredded a fence overnight. He jerked his chin toward the tool shed. She followed, hammering nails while he stretched new wire. They spoke with gestures, with the scrape of boards, with sweat darkening cloth. By noon the gap was sealed. She leaned on the post, breathless, smiling without meaning to. He wiped brow, offered her the canteen first. In the cool barn shade she found old tack molding on pegs. She stripped leather, cleaned it with saddle soap, worked oil into cracks until rains shone dark again. Clay watched from the door, a quiet astonishment in the set of his mouth. When she finished, he touched the bridle strand as if greeting a resurrected friend. That evening, the depot boy arrived on a lathered pony. Bridge mended, westbound coach due at dawn. Nora thanked him, slipped the letter into her bag, packed the nothing else she owned. Clay hammered a loose shutter, every strike louder than he meant. She stood by the corral fence, heart wobbling like a colt's first step. Leaving was simple. Staying felt like stepping off a cliff. Night thickened. She couldn't sleep, paced the porch where moths battered the lantern glass. Clay emerged, offered no greeting, only the still company of someone who knows words can bruise. She handed him the letter. He read the line, brow furrowing. You carry forgiveness for another? She shook her head. For myself, maybe. He folded the paper, returned it. Road's open now, he said. She nodded, yet feet rooted to the plank floor. Just before dawn, wagon wheels rattled at the distant depot. Coyotes yipped farewell. Nora swung her bag, stepped to the gate, paused. Clay's silence followed like heat. She turned, managed a half smile. He tipped his hat, but in the faint light she saw reluctance crease the brim. She took one step beyond the gate and stopped. The horizon ahead looked endless, yet colder than the hush behind her. She backed up, breath shaking, and closed the gate latch with slow care. He didn't move, only watched. She said, almost a whisper, "Coach can wait." His eyes held the sunrise and something softer. He tipped his hat again, this time in welcome rather than farewell. And when she crossed the yard toward the barn, her bag felt lighter than the letter inside. Rain held off all that morning, leaving the sky an uneasy pewter and the prairie humming with tension like wire before a storm. Nora tied her braid tight, rolled her sleeves, and followed Clay to the far pasture where winter-dead cotton hung in ragged rows. They worked in tandem, clearing stalks, burning piles small enough to keep sparks low. Smoke drifted over the acres, sweet with old sap, and somewhere in the haze she felt her restlessness soften. The road west receding from urgency to half-remembered dream. At midday, Clay lifted a hand, pointed toward a rocky rise that cut the field like a broken tooth. Wild bees had holed there last summer, and honey would keep through cold nights. He boosted her onto the ledge, his palms brief and steady on her boots. She smoked the entrance with a twist of sage, harvested comb dripping amber. When she passed the tin to him, he tasted with a fingertip, eyes narrowing in quiet pleasure. Without thinking, she licked the same spot, the intimacy so small yet startling that both turned away, embarrassed at a sweetness shared too directly. Evening slid over the ranch on a wind smelling of sagebrush and distant rain. Nora brought the letter to the porch rail, unfolded it once, again, as if repetition might conjure the sender. Her sister gone 2 winters, who had loved too hard and died too young, leaving forgiveness as the only inheritance Nora could carry. Clay saw the paper tremble, set his hand atop it, grounding the flutter. No questions, no pity, just presence. She let the page close and felt a knot inside her chest ease by a single breath's width. Days spilled forward like clear creek water. She mended curtains, coaxed green shoots from a neglected kitchen plot, patched Clay's coat where Thorne had ripped the elbow. He taught her how to thumb the Winchester clean, how to listen for the change in a stallion's breathing that meant fever. Words stayed sparse, but each chore, finished, left a seam of understanding stitched tighter between them. The kind built not from declarations, but from calloused hands passing a tool without fumbling. Nights they sat on the porch, lantern low, she with a novel rescued from the depot bin, he carving a new handle for her paring knife. Silence lay warm, not empty. When the moon climbed high, she would murmur a passage, and he would nod as if the cadence itself, not the meaning, mattered most. One afternoon, a lone rider approached, kicking dust like a comet tail. Nora stiffened at the gate, recognizing the scar on his cheek, the silver concho band glinting on his hat. Abram Voss, a trader notorious for lopsided deals, the man she had punched when he charged her sister's grave blanket double price, who had sworn he'd reclaim the debt in flesh. Clay stepped forward quietly, hand resting on the barn door where his shotgun leaned. Voss dismounted, smirked at Nora. "Thought you'd keep walking, girl. Goods here as sweet as they say?" His gaze raked the yard, calculating what could be taken. Clay spoke only once. "Ride on." The trader laughed, spat, and reached for his saddlebag. Nora's pulse roared like river flood, but Clay's movement was faster than thought. No shout, just the clean slide of the shotgun barrel rising to mid-chest height. The click carried farther than any curse. Voss froze, smiled thin, and back to his horse. "Know what keeps a ranch standing?" "Fear," he said, but Clay's eyes stayed flat as worn granite. The trader mounted, turned, and left without another word, dust swallowing him before threat could bloom. That night thunder finally broke, rattling window glass. Nora woke to find the bunkhouse roof leaking, water pooling near the foot of her cot. She grabbed a bucket, but Clay was already there. Hammer, nails, a strip of tar paper tucked under arm. They climbed into the storm, rain sheeting sideways, lantern useless against the black. Together they laid paper, hammered shingles back into place, laughter bursting each time a nail shot from frozen fingers. By the time they climbed down, soaked and shivering, Dawn had paled the eastern rim. Clay brewed coffee dark as mud. She draped her coat near the stove and watched steam rise from both it and his shoulders. He poured her a mug, hands trembling from cold, and she wrapped hers around his, warming knuckles bruised by hammer strikes. In that fragile moment, the porch felt less like shelter and more like common ground forged by weather and will. When the road dried, the depot wagon rattled by, driver waving newsprint. World's Fair coming east next spring, rail lines merging, fortunes shifting. Nora folded the paper, but did not feel the pull it promised. She found Clay repairing a lariat, knelt beside him, and placed the letter, their shared secret, into his tool chest. "It's time the road stopped owning me," she said. He set the rope aside, studied her face as though mapping new country. No smile, no flourish, only a softening around the eyes she now read as gratitude indistinguishable from affection. He pointed toward the half-cleared north pasture and the barn frame stacked ready for raising. She nodded, shouldered the mallet, and followed, the space between them filling not with words but with the scent of raw lumber and the quiet certainty of staying. Winter licked the plains with pale frost the morning they began to raise the north barn, just the two of them, breath smoking like twin engines in the thin air. Clay set the first post while Nora steadied the plumb line, her palms numbed through glove cloth, yet sure, as though every timber carried a secret weight only she could feel. They hoisted beams with a block and tackle rigged from storm-scarred rafters. Each creak of rope sounded like the groan of old grief being shouldered into place. By dusk, the frame stood skeletal against a violet sky, nails catching sunset like sparks caught in midair. Clay lit a lantern inside the empty shape, one flame beating back 3 walls of dusk, and in its flicker she saw what permanence looks like just before it becomes real. The next days blurred into honest fatigue. Horses fed, shingles set, milk warmed over iron, letters from the depot piling unopened on the mantel because the future required no external news to be believed. One night, while sanding floorboards smooth, Nora found her own pulse answering the rasp of paper against wood, each breath polishing the memory of flight into something glossy and still. She paused only when Clay's hand brushed sawdust from her hair, a gesture so brief it left warmth like a lantern after it's blown out. Snow fell thick a week later, muffling even the wind. They watched through the bunkhouse panes as cotton drifts erased fence lines, leaving the ranch a blank parchment. Clay strapped on snowshoes, led the mare to breaking hay paths. Nora followed with salt blocks balanced on a sled. White glare surrounded them so completely that they seemed to stride inside a silence older than language. At the far trough, she slipped, half buried, laughing because fear no longer answered the ground's sudden hunger. Clay hauled her upright, steadying her elbows longer than needed. His beard rhymed with ice, eyes bright as winter stars. She read in them a question, quiet and fierce. Is leaving still an option you keep close? Her answer hid in the smile that refused to fade even when cold bit bone. In February, chickens sickened. Fever swept the coop, wings dragged, eyes filmed. Clay prepared the cull knife, resignation carved into his shoulders, but Nora refused surrender. She brewed mash laced with crushed willow, sat for hours in straw, whispering patience until the birds began to peck again. 3 pullets died, 8 lived. Clay buried the lost behind the cottonwood, then sharpened the spade anyway, old habits hard to drop. She took the blade, slid it back into its sheath, laid her hand over his. Proof that mercy sometimes weighs more than efficiency. Come thaw, wagon wheels rumbled up the lane. A circuit preacher, lean and travel-cracked, offering scripture and seeds in equal measure. Clay traded honey for 2 sacks of barley, but the preacher lingered, eyeing Nora in silent appraisal. He ventured a question about vows. She glanced at Clay, saw him stiffen like a post driven too deep. She thanked the preacher, said the land still required both hands free. The man rode off, leaving behind a small tin cross she later hung in the barn, not for prayer but as a memory of choices not pressed. Spring exploded green, creek swollen, frogs chanting dusk hymns under the eaves. They seeded half an acre in barley and the rest in sweet corn, working till hands blistered anew. Nora tied a red ribbon at the edge row, a promise to herself that when tassels ripened, She would have stayed long enough for rustling music instead of stagecoach wheels. Clay watched the ribbon flutter and did not ask its meaning. Some symbols earn power by remaining unnamed. Night after planting, she woke to footsteps on hard-packed earth. Light, deliberate, not Clay's. Lantern raised, she saw Voss at the barn door, revolver glinting, 3 men behind him. He hissed that debts remained, that a ranch without neighbors made easy harvest. Before fear could root, the shotgun boomed from the loft where Clay kept night watch during foaling season. Pellets chewed the lintel, wood raining splinters around Voss's boots. Men scattered, firing blind into dark, but Clay owned shadows better. A second shell split the ground at their horses, and the animals bolted, dragging riders into chaos of rails and feed troughs. Nora watched from the tack room window, heart pounding a rhythm older than reason, as Clay descended, silhouette cut black against lantern glare. He said nothing while Voss crawled backward, cursing mud. Only when the traitor mounted bareback and galloped ragged toward the gate did Clay lower the gun. The silence afterward felt like rainfall withheld, heavy but life-granting. Days passed without further dust clouds on the horizon. Corn sprouted, barley waved, bees roared. Clay took to leaving his tools exactly where Nora would next look, trusting her hands to finish what his could not. She began writing lists on scrap wood, boards needed, herbs to gather, signs that assumed a future. At dusk, they carried chairs to the new barn's threshold, walls bright with fresh stain, and sat where wind threaded the open doors, sipping coffee that tasted of risk accepted. One late June afternoon, the depot driver arrived with a sealed envelope edged in black. Nora's fingers trembled before she opened it. Estate lawyers finalizing her sister's affairs, an inheritance small but untethered, enough to buy a ticket anywhere rail reached. She stared at the strip of banknote folded inside, felt the weight of metal rails stretching past every horizon, then folded the note smaller and smaller until it became a square no larger than a thimble. That night she placed it in the tin box with Clay's first thank you note, shut the lid, and slid it onto the highest shelf of the new barn, out of reach but not out of memory. Barley heads turned gold. Corn tassels rattled music along the rows. On Harvest Eve, Clay found Nora by the ribbon, hands stroking the silk frayed by months of wind. He offered the shears. She shook her head, pulled the ribbon free and slipped it over his wrist, not firm, a color splash against sun-dark skin. He caught her other hand, calloused palm fitting calloused palm, and led her down the row where earth smelled like bread before baking. They stored the grain in tight sacks, laughter flying with chaff each time a kernel popped. That night, lightning spidered low clouds, heat teasing a storm, and the porch boards creaked beneath their bare feet as they watched Skyfire dance. Rain began, warm and heavy, soaking shirts translucent. Nora tilted her face into it, eyes closed. Clay reached, wiped water from her cheekbone with the back of one gentle finger, then kissed the spot as though sealing a wound shut. She opened her eyes, saw her own shock mirrored in his, then answered with a kiss less hesitant, tasting rain, salt, and the hum of a silence that at last dared speak. At dawn, they sat shoulder to shoulder on the barn threshold, steam rising from fields like ghosts leaving. Nora opened her hand. Inside lay the folded note from the lawyers, edges soggy, ink bled into blue veins. Clay stared, question caught behind his teeth. She let the wind take the fragment, watched it tumble, land, dissolve into wet earth. Then she produced the old letter of forgiveness, unfolded it one last time. Read the line aloud, voice steady. Find him, tell him I forgive. She touched Clay's chest. Found him. A pause, then softer. I stay. He nodded once as if confirming a ledger entry, then rose, stretched, and spoke the first full sentence she had heard in days. Barn roof needs paint come noon. She laughed, a bright echoing ring that rolled across the prairie like a church bell without walls. She followed him into sunlight, already warming the wood, already promising the color of safe horizons, and with each brush stroke, each heartbeat, the ranch leaned into forever, not from duty, but from a silence warmer than words. The summer rolled into a copper-hot autumn, corn sheaves stacked high beside barley sacks, and the new barn's walls darkened to a mellow chestnut under sun and rain. Nora and Clay worked through the days with the easy cadence of two breaths drawn from the same lung. He split posts, she sank them. She carded wool sent by a distant neighbor. He built the loom from cedar scraps. Nights they spread grain on canvas between rows to dry beneath a prairie sky pierced by meteors, their shoulders brushing as they pulled the cloth taut against sudden gusts. When chill crept out of the stars, Clay brought a quilt and settled beside her on the warm boards. She leaned back until her head rested on his thigh, and in that quiet tilt of trust they both learned how a future starts without fanfare. No letter came from boss, no fresh claim from the rail company. Beyond the gate the world trudged onward, but Sunrise Bend seemed held within a circle of wind, too gentle to carry threats. In late October, Clay rode to the county fair with 2 sacks of honeycomb and Nora's jars of pickled beets. He returned with a blue ribbon and a set of china cups she'd admired months before, nested in straw. The ribbon he tacked over the barn door, the cups he set on the kitchen shelf with clumsy care, then blushed at her astonished grin. They drank chicory from those cups that night, and she teased him for holding the handle like crystal, as if one slip might shatter the promise of gentility. He only smiled, shoulders loose, and for the first time used her name like a touch. Nora, they're yours as much as any sky you can see from here. Winter heavy-hauled in, blanketing pasture and roof. Wind moaned through the stovepipe, and owls spoke in the barn rafters. Clay dragged his cot from the cold tack room to the cabin corner. But one sleepless night when sleet rattled the panes, she crossed the floor carrying both quilts, laid them over his chest, then slid beneath, her back curved into the shape of belonging. He wrapped an arm around her without a word. Outside, ice ticked on the shutters, yet warmth pooled where their knees touched, and neither moved until dawn smeared gray across the ceiling. From that morning forward, the cot stood empty, a quiet relic of solitude surrendered. February brought a telegraph on yellow paper stamped URGENT. Clay unfolded it at the table while Nora kneaded bread. A cousin he hadn't seen in 10 years was dying back east. Barn auction scheduled, no one left to tend the graveyard family plot. He stared at the words, jaw set. Travel would steal 3 weeks of feed runs, maybe more if snow closed the pass. Nora wiped flour from her knuckles, read the telegram, then said simple, "Go." Sunrise Bend will stand. They argued only over the mare. She insisted he take the stronger horse and the Winchester. He yielded when she reminded him she could still outshoot most drifters with the revolver. At dawn he rode out, head low against the wind, but halfway down the lane turned to see her standing on the porch rail, hair snapping like a banner, and the sight stayed with him through every empty mile. Storms chewed the horizon while he was gone. Nora hauled hay, broke ice in troughs, stitched a gash on a colt's flank, and on the coldest night melted snow in the fireplace when the pump seized. Alone beneath an amber lantern, she read the folded letter one last time, then fed it to the flames, not in farewell to her sister, but because its message had already come true and need no longer bind her to grief. Ash curled upward. Wind drew it into the dark, and her chest felt light enough to float. Clay returned under a pale March moon, saddle creaking, beard thicker, eyes tired yet bright with relief at each intact board he passed. She ran from the porch, snow crunching, caught his coat before his boot touched earth. He smelled of train smoke and memory. Without letting her step back, he pressed a bundle into her palm, a thin gold ring shaped like an unbroken lariat. "Couldn't find words on the platform," he said, voice brittle as first ice on the pond. "But these look right." She slid the circle onto her finger and answered by taking his calloused hand in both of hers, guiding him toward the glowing doorway that had waited through every mile of his leaving. Spring thawed the ground, birds nested in the barn eaves, calves kicked through mud with new lungs. They wed beneath the cottonwood that had once carried a rope, now crowned in pale buds, Deputy Stone riding out to sign the license and share whiskey in enamel cups. No vows louder than necessary, he promised to keep her letters unopened unless asked. She promised to speak even when silence felt easier. Friends gathered in a loose circle, Wade and Ayana from the far border pasture, the preacher who still traded seeds, the depot boy who'd once waved every westbound coach, and they feasted on honey bread and fried corn as dusk flamed the sky. That night, lightning danced beyond the ridge, but rain never touched Sunrise Bend. Nora left the cabin door wide, letting warm wind wander the rooms. Clay carried her across the threshold anyway, feet bare, laughter echoing against log walls that no longer remembered loneliness. In the hush that followed, he traced the ribbon scar on her neck like reading Braille, and she rested a palm over the healed knot in his heart. Both marks proof that bruises may fade, yet still write maps for gentle hands. Harvest multiplied, years stacked like hay bales in the loft. Travelers kept coming, a runaway boy seeking rail work, an old laundress fleeing city soot, a piano tuner who slept in the hay and left a lullaby lingering on the rafters. Each was fed, each rode on lighter, and each carried rumors of a ranch where silence welcomed and held no knife. On one gold September morning, Nora knelt beside a new garden bed, her belly rounding the apron cloth. Clay approached with water, pausing to watch her fingers press seedlings into damp soil, planting next season with a patience he had learned from her. She looked up, smiled, and in that slow curve of mouth he saw the horizon he'd once thought dead rediscovered alive. That evening they sat under the porch roof while dusk swallowed the last ridge. Nora took from her pocket the tiny square of heritage money, edges worn soft. She unfolded it, laid it on his knee, and together they used it to light the first wick of a newborn lantern. "Fuel for the barn once the baby came," she said. Flame blossomed, steady and bright, and Clay wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as night wrapped the prairie. Far beyond, stagecoach wheels traced their old paths, but the sound no longer tugged at her bones. Sunrise Bend beat in her chest like a second heart, its silence a warmth words could only circle but never hold. Autumn bled into another winter, and Sunrise Bend settled into a heartbeat so steady the prairie itself seemed to time its winds to the ranch's quiet pulse. Clay and Nora rose before dawn, now not by habit alone, but by the soft thump of small feet in the cradle Clay had built from scrap cedar. Little Joanna, named after Nora's sister, blossomed beneath thick quilts, her dark eyes open to every flicker of lamplight, as if memorizing the world before it fully woke. When she cried for milk, Nora would pace the kitchen, humming the lullaby the traveling piano tuner had left behind, her voice a thread stitching night to dawn. Clay would stoke the fire, slip outside to check the sky, and return smelling of hay and frost, his beard tipped with diamonds of ice that melted against the baby's cheeks as she drifted back to sleep. Work never paused. Snowstorm after snowstorm rolled across the flats, carving white dunes against the fence lines. Clay shoveled drifts clear from barn doors. Nora raked cinders across the walk so chickens could peck without freezing their feet. In the lean hours between chores, they tanned a hide Clay had taken from an old bull fallen to wolves and stitched it into a thick baby wrap. When the wind howled across the ridge, Nora bundled Joanna inside that warm sling and followed Clay on feed rounds, the infant cradled against her chest, heartbeat echoing the mare's steady clip. In January, Deputy Stone arrived with a sealed envelope. The county offered to purchase a right-of-way through Sunrise Bend for a telegraph spur. The price could have bought them comforts no rancher dared dream. Iron stove, hired help, schooling in town for the baby one day. Yet the line would slice the north pasture, scattering the skylark nests Nora cherished at dawn. Clay read the offer twice, folded it neat, handed it to Nora. She shook her head. The prairie feeds on quiet more than on coin. Stone nodded, no surprise. Rumor already named Sunrise Bend the ranch that sold silence. She tucked the proposal back in her bag, rode off under low clouds streaked like ash, leaving behind only hoof prints soon filled with drifting snow. Spring returned on a single warm wind that melted creek ice overnight. Calves balled into life, mud swallowed boots, and the fence by the West Ravine gave way under the thaw. Nora hammered new stakes while Joanna, now toddling, chased frogs along the water edge, her giggles spilling like creek run. Clay watched them from the rise, heart raveling into threads he never wanted untied. That night he pulled a small cedar chest from under the bed. Inside lay the ribbon Nora had once tied to the corn row, the tin cross from the seed preacher, the blue fair ribbon, and a wooden rattle he had carved during blizzards. He added the folded telegraph offer, tied shut with rawhide, and stored the box in the barn loft, a reliquary of choices kept. By midsummer, barley stood shoulder-high and corn-tasseled, and Joanna spoke her first clear sentence. Sky hum. She pointed past the creek where storm clouds grumbled. Clay laughed and hoisted her high. Nora felt her heart swell until it pressed the edges of memory, and for the first time the letter's absence did not ache but glowed, as if the promise had finally burned bright enough to light itself. Harvest came early that year, sun fierce, wind soft, grain dry on the stalk. Neighbors from 2 counties out arrived to help thresh, drawn by stories of Sunrise Ben's generous tables and the rumor that it's barley baked into bread that soothed even a widow's grief. They pitched tents along the creek, filled the night with fiddle reels, and left mornings with wagons stacked high with sacks stamped a simple brand. SB entwined with a small hawk silhouette that Ayana had sent carved by her own hand. On the last night of Harvest Festival, when embers winked low and coyotes sang, Nora sat at the edge of the fire ring, Clay beside her, Joanna asleep across both their laps. She traced the hawk stamp with a fingertip, felt the raised grain, and whispered, strangers arrive and leave, but they always carry our silence with them. Clay nodded, staring into stars. Silence travels farther than wagons. She leaned into his shoulder, feeling the ribbon scar on her neck itch in the summer heat, a reminder of roads unchosen. Yet in that itch lived no regret, only proof of skin that had healed strong. Years would pass, fences would break again, storms would test roofs. Another child, Samuel, would come howling into a February dawn when the barn roof groaned under ice. Sunrise Bend would stretch more acres south, adopt strays both horse and human, become a waypoint marked on traveler maps as a black dot with one word, welcome. But on this quiet night, with their first harvest stacked safe and a child's even breathing warming their arms, Nora and Clay understood that staying forever is not a single act. It is 1,000 silent choices, hammered like nails into the long grain of days. They rose, carried Joanna into the new barn, laid her on sweet alfalfa beneath rafters, faintly smelling of cedar and honeycomb. Lantern light played across beams darkened by time, and the place felt less like a structure and more like a cradle grown large enough to hold them all. Clay pulled Nora close, resting his forehead against hers. No vow was spoken. Vows seemed redundant within walls built board by board of deed and quiet. Outside, the moon crowned the cottonwood, now tall, rope-scar, long-heeled, casting a silver path toward a dawn still hidden but certain as the warmth of silent words resting between two hearts that had finally found home.